You know, I think that I thought I was hot shit when I started doing the $15 decks, and they performed really well. The problem that I've ran into is that as I've looked at older decks of mine that I've made, I realized that I have become a much better deck builder now, which means I'm probably not actually that great of a deck builder now at all, because me in 5 months from now is going to look back on my current deck building practices and say, that guy could do better. But I guess what I'm trying to say is there are some things that you learn over time by repeating a skill over and over and over again. In this case, it's taking one of my favorite decks and learning how to make her that much better at a very, very slim price point. And this is one of the decks I'm going to be taking with me to the Too Many Games convention in Philadelphia if you would like to try your hand at fighting her. That all said, let's get into the core strategy of $15 Sefris of the Hidden Ways. Now that I've updated her and done a lot more work into making sure what ticks for her ticks right. The core strategy of Sefris is simple but deceptively complicated. Whenever one of your creature cards, specifically cards, touches the graveyard from anywhere, you get to venture into the dungeon. This puts you further into a mini-game that I'll get into in a second. If you complete a dungeon, then you can return any creature from your graveyard to the battlefield at instant speed. Note, Sefris only triggers once per turn, unless you decide to do some pretty shady blinky shenanigans with her. Now, Sefris, like I said, is a deceptively complicated while very simple card. On the surface, she wants you to just have creatures die and reanimate creatures. Honestly, pretty simple strategy. The problem is that the dungeon consists of 1, 2, 3, and 4 different mini games you can pick from depending on the circumstances. So we need to go into each of these and talk about why they are what they are. Lost Mines of Phandelver says that you scry 1 when you enter it, and then you get a choice the next time you venture into the dungeon. Either go into the Goblin Lair or the Mine Tunnels. Mine Tunnels will let you create a treasure token, while Goblin Lair makes a 1/1 red goblin creature token. And here's where the first layer of things gets kind of interesting. So Sefris only sees creature cards touching a graveyard, so the usual aristocratic strategy of generating lots of tokens and using them for value literally will not work in Sefris. After that, you just follow the arrows. So if you're in the Goblin Lair, you can go into the storeroom or Dark Pool, and if you're in the Mine Tunnels, you can go into the Fungi Cavern or Dark Pool. All roads eventually lead to the Temple of Dumathoin, and the temple allows you to draw a card, which means as soon as you finish drawing that card, Sefris will reanimate a thing from the graveyard at instant speed because you have completed a dungeon. Now, the good thing about a dungeon like the Lost Mines of Phandelver is it only has 4 rooms, and since there are usually 4 players at our commander pods, this should mean that we can always complete the dungeon at least once if we are properly set up, thereby regenerating, well, not regenerating because that's dead keyword, but reanimating a creature at least once every turn cycle, again, so long as there's not other shenanigans that we are doing. We do have other options of dungeons to go into, like the Dungeon of the Mad Mage, which honestly has a very good payoff of drawing us 3 cards and letting us cast any one of those 3 without paying its mana cost. The problem with this dungeon specifically, though, is that it has 7 rooms to go through, which means you have to spend at least 2 turn cycles, again, barring any other shenanigans you may be running, to get this off. And very few players are going to allow you to go through Dungeon of the Mad Mage. Oftentimes, people will disrupt your strategy far before you can complete this dungeon. When I was new to playing Sefris, this is the dungeon I went through all the time because that payoff was super cool. The longer I play Sefris, the more I realize that Lost Mines of Phandelver is generally the way to go. Tomb of Annihilation is, well, it is an option. You probably shouldn't use this option, but it is there. And then the Undercity can only be gone into if you have used a card that gives you the initiative. You cannot enter it by entering the dungeon. You can only enter it by specifically venturing into the Undercity. But it does have the strongest payoff of any of these abilities, letting you reveal the top 10 cards of your library and putting a creature from among them onto the battlefield. Undercity is where I like to be in my dungeoneering if I am on the back foot, because that tempo swing from the Throne of the Dead 3 can help us out a ton. Whereas if we are constantly using the Lost Mines of Phandelver, what a seasoned player will do is they will snipe Sefris right before you finish the dungeon, never allowing you to get more than your draw 1 out of it. Whereas the Undercity, even if you lose Sefris, will still get you massive value. So our core strategy is going to be to abuse this dungeon mechanic as much as possible. And the way we're going to be doing that is using a few of these guys. Radiant Solar is the biggest one of all of them, having flying and lifelink, and anytime it or another non-token creature touches the battlefield, you enter the dungeon. We also have the ability to discard it to enter into the dungeon using its ability, which is basically a cycle, and Sefris can see creatures hitting the graveyard from anywhere, so this will give us 2 dungeon runs in a single go. Oftentimes doing this at the end of an opponent's turn and then automatically reanimating Radiant Solar, thereby getting us a 3rd dungeon run and setting us up for the next turn, is a very powerful strategy. If you're fighting against the Sefris player, this is the card to get rid of. Dear God, I am begging you, if you are fighting a Sefris player, this is the linchpin. Get rid of this. The deck speed is cut in half. The thing is printed on cocaine. Then we have Nadar, Selfless Paladin, a 3-mana creature that gives us the it doesn't give us the initiative. It lets us venture into the dungeon when it touches the battlefield or when it attacks. It also has a lording effect that we can use, but oftentimes that's not going to matter as much, as this deck kind of skips out on its combat phase a lot. Ravenloft Adventurer is one of our ways of doing the initiative, and if it pops on the board, it's a lightning rod for removal because it will exile anything that our opponents have that die. It's effectively a Dalthy Voidwalker, but for dungeon runners. Then we have the Arakoa Sneak, which gives us the initiative when it touches the battlefield, and also just happens to be a 1/4 flyer, which is sometimes important depending on the situation that you find yourself in. Also, to supplement all of these ways to go into the dungeon, we've also added in Mirror Image as well. And just so you know, if you are playing Mirror Image, the correct printing is this one right here, this one here. This is the correct printing for you to use. Every other one is effectively illegal. Do not run them. But anyway, with that said, Mirror Image is just a 3-mana copy card. Copies any creature you control. Copy Crook does the same thing for 4 mana, but it also gives us a Connive trigger we can abuse, because Connive can actually trigger Sefris pretty easily. Tomb of Horrors Adventurer can copy spells we cast, and it also gives us the initiative when it touches the board, and it can copy those spells twice if we have gone into the dungeon and completed it at least once. Finally, we have Visage Bandit, who comes into the battlefield as a copy of any creature, but the important part about it is it does have plot, so we can actually play it on a turn before we have setup and then use it later. A very good thing to do with clones early in the game while you are setting up, if you just need to go and use dungeon runs to get a better hand setup, you can throw clones on Sefris and let the legendary trigger kill them so that you can get free dungeon runs. There's also a way to build up a full board state in a single move using these clones that I'll show you here in a bit. In fact, actually, I think I might as well show you that right now since we're talking about that. Let me introduce you to Sister Hospitaller. This is part of our 8-card reanimation package, and the Sister reanimates any creature from our graveyard, which is fine, and then gives us life equal to their mana value. So here's what we're going to be doing with the Sister. If Sefris finishes a dungeon and then we reanimate a creature from our grave, you reanimate Sister Hospitaller. Then you use Sister Hospitaller to reanimate a clone. That clone comes into the battlefield and you'll gain life equal to the mana value of the clone, but the clone comes into the battlefield as a copy of the Sister, meaning that it will trigger again, reanimating another card from your graveyard. Ideally, you should be reanimating another clone and another clone until you run out of clones. Once you run out of clones, then you start reanimating the other reanimation targets who are in the deck, like, say, reanimating Karmic Guide, and then after you reanimate Karmic Guide, use it to reanimate Sun Titan or Redemption Choir. This way, no matter how many times somebody board wipes you, you should be able to reestablish a 4 to 8 creature board until somebody inevitably Bajuka bogs you like a good player running interaction should. Each of these have the ability to reanimate a card, and looking at each of them, they fill a specific role. Redemption Choir and Sun Titan can reanimate anything with mana value 3 or less, including lands when we need them to. Karmic Guide can reanimate a creature and then kill itself on our subsequent turn, which is also important because that will trigger Sefris. And then Victimize is in here because it will trigger Sefris while also reanimating 2 creature cards. Then we have Barrowan of Clan Undur. Barrowan ventures into the dungeon when it touches the board, and also whenever it swings, it will reanimate a creature from the graveyard if we've already completed a dungeon. That's a very good thing to take advantage of, especially when you consider that we can reanimate more clones. Dread Return is a very simple reanimation spell we have access to as well that can be used twice, so long as we're willing to sack 3 creatures with it later, which we can use to trigger Sefris. And Altar of Baal is an all-star in any reanimator deck that has access to tokens. In our case, we're going to use the Goblin token from Lost Mind of Fendelver and throw it away to the Altar of Baal anytime we have an opportunity. This will mean that we never have to actually lose a creature when we're using the altar. I've seen people not like Altar of Baal solely because it makes you exile the creature that you use as material, and all I have to say to that is, I feel you, I understand you, you're playing the card wrong, and you know it. If you've watched anybody who's using a token deck use Altar of Baal, it's really easy to recognize, oh, they're just getting rid of tokens to use that effect, and they're never using that bone offering on the left-hand side because it's almost never relevant. We also need to trigger Sefris as often as possible, so we also have some sack outlets in the deck to take advantage of. 5 of them in the main deck, and then a tutor that will trigger Sefris as well. In the budget version of the deck, we are running a Cartel Aristocrat that gains protection from any color if you use its effect. Phyrexian Ghoul can sack a creature at instant speed to give itself 2/2. Viscera Seer can sack a creature at instant speed to scry us by 1. Vampiric Rites can sack a creature for 2 mana and give us a life and drawing us a card. And Tarian's Journal can sack, but only at sorcery speed. However, Tarian's Journal has the benefit of being able to flip into the Tomb of Aklazatz, which lets us reanimate creatures from our grave for a last show on Earth if we need it to. Oftentimes, you'll keep the Tarian's Journal as it is, but sometimes you may only have a card or 2 left in your hand. One of those cards may be a creature, so it may actually behoove you to dump your hand away to flip it into the land and have access to that revive if things have not been going your way throughout the game. And we also have a singular tutor in Vile Entomber. The Vile Entomber enters the battlefield, lets us search our library for any card, and throw it into the graveyard. Sefris can see that happening, so Sefris will automatically trigger, and sometimes, if we have set up correctly, the Vile Entomber will just throw an important piece into the grave and it will auto-revive. Oftentimes, you want to, if you've already got some clones in the grave, throw away Sister Hospitaller or Karmic Guide into the grave to begin gritting all of your creatures onto the board. Remember that getting all those creatures on the board while having a sack outlet is super important because Sefris can only see non-tokens getting killed. So many times we will just be sacking one of those creatures on every other opponent's turn as they're ending their turns to get at least one more trigger of Sefris and get further down to get another revive. And the revives that we've talked about so far are okay, but when we get to the removal section, you'll understand where a lot of the power from our revival package is coming from. But with that said, let's talk about how we're digging through our deck. Let's talk about draw. Drawing in Sefris is separated into 2 main categories: cards that draw and cards that draw and discard, typically known as looting. So let's start with the cards that just draw us, and we want to make sure that even the cards that are just drawing us through our deck are serving double duty, basically. We want them to trigger Sefris as well. So the first one of those is going to be Mulldrifter. We can evoke it for 2, draw 2 cards, and then the Mulldrifter will die. For 16 cents, honestly, great rate of return. Then we have the Everflowing Well, which when it enters the battlefield, we mill 2 cards, then draw 2 cards. It has the ability to flip into something as well if we need it to later, and sometimes the cloning of the Myriad Pools matters, but oftentimes the Everflowing Well is primarily going to be here to mill us a little bit, triggering Sefris because she does trigger off of mill. Finally, we have Factor Fiction, Sauron's Ransom, and Hostile Negotiations. Each one of these is effectively serving the same job. They have some variation of exiling a bunch of cards from the top of our deck, showing them to our opponents, and then letting them pick which cards go to our hand and which ones go to our graveyard, triggering Sefris. They're all also instant cast cards, so you want to hold them up until your opponent's turn, where it's normally harder for you to find ways to throw cards away. Hostile Negotiations does a pick a door number 1, door number 2 scenario, where one pile of 3 cards is hidden and the other pile is not, and you get to pick which ones are which. Factor Fiction reveals 5 and throws them at your opponent, and they separate them into piles, and then you pick from 2 known piles. And then Sauron's Ransom does the door number 2, door number 1 thing, but in reverse with only 4 cards, and you pick the opponent before you look at anything. So all of them are effectively doing slight variations on the same thing. The next draw cards we have are the draw discards, beginning with Vohar, Vidalian Desecrator. He draws as a card and discards as a card, and if it's an instant or sorcery we throw away, which is probably never going to happen, each opponent burns. He's also got the ability to sack himself and cast an instant or sorcery from our graveyard only as a sorcery. Oftentimes, if you're doing this, it's to get the sacrifice effect, trigger Sefris, and then activate something like a Factor Fiction from your graveyard. Otherwise, he's effectively going to be a glorified Merfolk Looter, which we're also running, because for 12 cents, it fixes a ton of problems. It lets us draw a card and discard a card at a really good rate of 0 mana. Next, we have Matsalanti the Great Door, which does the exact same thing, but we can also transform it later in the game to the core, which will give us X mana of any one color, where X is the number of permanent cards in our graveyard. Then we have Dihada's Ploy, which draws us 2 and discards us 1, then gains us life for however many cards we've discarded that turn. Typically, this will be 1. We also have Jumpstart on it, so we can cast it from the graveyard once more later on in the game. When you upgrade this deck, you're going to want to turn this to Faithful Mending just because it's a little more mana efficient and the life gain is a little bit better, but otherwise it's doing the same exact job. Then we have Obsessive Stitcher. This lets us draw a card and discard a card just like the Door and Merfolk Looter and Vohar, but we have the ability to sacrifice it to return a creature from our graveyard to the battlefield at instant speed if we are done looting through and setting up our graveyard. Every single one of these is serving double duty in being draw cards that also trigger Sefris, but also remember that you're going to be incrementally drawing lots of cards by going through the various dungeons that you're picking. We get a really strong draw effect by going through the initiative on the left-hand side of the dungeon. We also have a really strong draw effect in repeating Lost Mine of Phandelver. So never forget that we're not just limited to casting cards to dig through the dungeon. But we do need to do something else that's very important: stop our opponents from winning the game. Alrighty, let's talk removal and interaction, the bread and butter of this deck. Sefris wants to be removing things constantly and be the only one with a board state so that it can win via incremental damage from burning people with the dungeon, and also good old-fashioned fisticuffs, punching people in the face a lot. So to keep the board clear so that we can make sure that happens, let's take a look at the 17-card interaction package. So, starting off, we have Bar the Gate, which can let us venture into the dungeon after countering a creature or a planeswalker spell. Stronghold Biologist, which lets us discard a card from our hand, triggering Sefris to counter any creature spell. Angel of the Ruins, which we can plane cycle, triggering Sefris to get any land that we need into our hand, and also the Angel of Ruins lets us exile 2 artifacts and or enchantments from the board when it touches the board. It's also a 5/7 flyer, so reanimating it and punching somebody in the noggin over and over again is a viable strategy. Meteor Golem is also in here because my son can do no wrong. And Meteor Golem blows up any non-land permanent an opponent controls. Very, very good reanimation target, and I use it even in the full power version of Sefris. Negate and Wizard's Retort give us access to even more counter spells in our deck. Demon's Disciple automatically sacrifices itself when it touches the board, which will trigger Sefris and remove a bunch of other creatures from the board. Utter End exiles a non-land permanent at instant speed. Ashen Rider exiles any permanent and also does it when it ETBs or dies. So the Ashen Rider is one of the most powerful things is in our deck if we can throw it away with our 1 tutor and have it ready for removal. Accursed Marauder is a new creature to throw into the deck. Nice and round 21 cents for a 2-mana Fleshbag Marauder, which dodges token creature removal. So he is wonderful. Kills any non-token creature for you as you need. Prismaris Eliminator can blow up a creature when it touches the board, or give all creatures a player controls -2/-2, effectively being a budget massacre worm for our deck. Plague Crafter is the same as Demon's Disciple and Accursed Marauder, makes people sacrifice creatures or planeswalkers or discard cards depending on what they have available. Also trigger Sefris. Then we have Ravenous Chupacabra, which will blow up a creature when it touches the board, and of course we can then sack it to one of our sack outlets to give Sefris a good bit of recursion. Every single time Sefris sees something dies, she's gonna make more things happen on the board. Butcher of Malakir will see all of our sacrifices and make people sacrifice creatures alongside us as we do so. Cathar Commando can sack itself to blow up any artifact or enchantment. Rite of Oblivion wants us to sack a creature in order, or any non-land permanent rather, to exile any non-land permanent, and it's got flashback, so we get access to it twice. Rite of Oblivion is fantastic since we want to sack creatures for Sefris. And Fell the Profane can blow up a creature or a planeswalker while conveniently being a land on the backside, as it is an MDFC. I love Fell the Profane, and I think it should go in any deck with black mana now. I think bolt lands are cool. Anyways, that's it for the removal section. Let's talk about how we are going to be building up to some of our bigger spells. Facilitate making sure we have the colors to play Sefris early, we are running a lot of 2-mana mana rocks here, and I still really enjoy 3-mana mana rocks. I think that they are fun, and people who don't like them are unfun and don't like having fun. But in the 2-mana mana rock section, let's start with the diamond cycle. We're running Marble, Charcoal, and Sky Diamond. Each one of these taps for one of our commander's colors. Mere Convert can tap for all of our commander's colors if we need it to. Wayfarer's Bauble can get any basic land from our deck onto the battlefield tapped. Orzhov Signet, Dimir Signet, and of course Azorius Signet are new ones in this particular deck because they were a bit overcosted when I originally built the deck. Each of these taps for a combination of our deck's colors. Ornithopter of Paradise taps for all of our deck's colors, as does Arcane Signet. Solemn Simulacrum can get any basic land from our deck like the Wayfarer's Bauble can, but this one is recurable and draws us cards when we sack it. There's lots of times where I'll just resummon Solemn Simulacrum to get a better land state. And then finally we have Honored Heirloom, not just because Rainbow Rock goes in every deck, but also because Honored Heirloom gives us access to graveyard removal in the ramp zone, which I find very, very important and very underrated. But past that, let's talk about the lands we are running. 36 of them, and we'll start with the dual lands of the deck. We are running 13 dual lands, beginning with Cave of Kolios as a pain land, and then we have Shine Shadow Snarl, Tainted Isle, and Prairie Stream, Sunken Hollow, Port Town, Dark Water Catacombs, River of Tears, Choke Estuary, Skyclad Expanse, Irrigated Farmland, and Tainted Field all serve various purposes. Most of these come into play untapped, with the exception of the Irrigated Farmland, but it has the benefit of being a Plains Island, so we can actually grab it with Plains Cycling if we need to. It also can cycle itself if we are mana flooded, and Orzhov Basilica gives us access to a bounce land, which I think is really good to have in a deck that desperately wants its colors to hit. Orzhov Basilica can come down and let us keep 2 lander hands. It also lets us recycle certain utility lands, which I'll get into in a second. Then we have 8 fetching lands in the deck. Contaminated Landscape is the newcomer from Modern Horizons 3. I adore this thing. It's an Evolving Wilds that can tap for colorless mana in general. There's no downside to this guy. And we can cycle it if we get mana flooded. I adore this thing, and I think everybody should consider running these guys. Then we have Escape Tunnel, Terramorphic Expanse, and Evolving Wilds. Somebody asked me recently why I like these in decks, and it's because oftentimes players don't really value what a deck shuffle is doing for them. Many times, especially in budget decks, having a little bit of deck thinning to make it just that much easier to hit your stuff is important. It may not be mathematically significant, but it does end up feeling better and smooths decks out when you feel like you are getting flooded. And Sefris is a deck that can run off a below curve if it desperately needs to. I don't actually hate these guys. Yeah, the land comes into play tapped, but you pick the land that you need, and again, there are plenty of situations where a deck shuffle is important. Myriad Landscape can ramp us if we need it to. Esper Panorama can do what Contaminated Landscape is doing, but not as power crept as the landscape. And then we have Ash Barrens as well, since Ash Barrens can let us go into the deck and grab any basic land that we need by cycling it. We can also use Shire Terrace. Shire Terrace gives us the same ability as Esper Panorama. Normally, we'd be running Promising Vein as well, but I'm gonna be honest, we're a little tight for space in the land area as we're only running 9 basics somehow in a budget deck. Speaking of our basics, we have, as I said, 3 of each of those: 3 swamps, 3 plains, and 3 islands. But we're not done with the lands. We've still got a few more. We have the Omni Lands, Exotic Orchard, and Command Tower to tap for all of our deck's colors. And then we have Pit of Offerings, which can let us remove things from graveyards when we need to, and Port of Carfell that can sacrifice itself to reanimate creatures at instant speed if we need it. There's lots of situations where you can just sit on a Port of Carfell while you have an Ashen Rider in the grave and let your opponents do whatever the hell they want, because even though you have no hand and no board, you don't necessarily have no options. Hi there. You've made it to the upgrade section of the video. This is where I talk about upgrades to a $15 deck. Hey, look at that. This is the upgrade video for Sefris. This is the video that goes over all the upgrades you can make to the deck. This is the part where you click on that video and watch it for all the upgrades. Otherwise, I'll stick a 52-minute video in here, and it will be funny. It will make the video about an hour and a half long, and basically unwatchable. Or, you can skip ahead to the conclusion section. Right about... In conclusion, Sefris is an incredibly versatile commander, even though she looks like she has a very linear strategy on the surface. Having access to as many reanimation methods as she does, both in the 99 and the ways that you can trigger her ability with what she is trying to do, means that you will always have a game that feels different from the last one. She's got a lot of variance in play, and I think if you have not given her a try already, or you really don't like dungeons that much, maybe give her a shot anyway. She may sell you on the idea. That said, let me know what you think in the comment section below. I just wanted to update that deck for all of you because I feel like I did a bit of a poor job the last time that I worked on her, and now that I've got her where she is, this is the version of Sefris that I'll be taking with me to the Too Many Games convention when that happens here in a few weeks. So, hey, if you're going to be in Philadelphia, let me know, and we can get a game in at some point. That all said, though, let's see if you guys are gonna give me shit in the comment section, because let's be honest, I probably deserve it at this point. Thank you for watching, and insert end of video tagline here. Hey, I just quickly want to give a thank you to all of my wonderful patrons who keep this show running. YouTube and Twitch are a pretty bumpy ride at the best of times, and the stability that Patreon provides me is worth more than I can say here. I'd also like to thank each and every one of my $20 and up patrons here, and they would be Red Joker, Britzkrieg, Cameron, Dren, Jemshin, Smiling DM, Poundini, Mabbity Babbity, Naomi, Isaac, Agamotto, Jordan, Ravi, Giuni, Kiratorian, Prisma, all of you, Sagitt, I'm not saying that part, and Starlight. And finally, thank you to everyone else that helps keep this channel alive. While you're here, why not check out another video? And thank you for watching.